So good morning, everyone. Welcome and thank you for taking part in this Centre for Cross-Border seminar this morning. It's great to see such interest in an important topic like this in terms of the positive impact that taking an all-island perspective to regional growth could make, and particularly on the emphasis of the need to consider the interconnectedness and opportunities, particularly for border regions in terms of spatial growth strategies. I know from working with Anthony and Anne-Marie in the past that while there are challenges to doing this, particularly at central government level, actually when it comes to sub-regional level, there's already some really excellent cooperation taking place and a willingness and acknowledgement that more needs to take place. So I think that's something in the background to say that there's a demonstration effect already in place. This seminar this morning delves into Niall and Brendan's discussion paper on regional development from an all-island perspective, as highlighted in the report Accelerating Growth, which the Centre published in April. Niall O'Donnellan, and I'm going to introduce this Niall. Everybody's probably looking and saying it's Niall, but it actually isn't. So we were all calling him. We were all calling Niall, but it's actually Niall. And Niall's a co-author of the Accelerating Growth report and an independent strategic advisor and development economist. And in addition, although unfortunately not here at the moment due to illness, Brendan McCormack is a co-author of the report, and he's head of the ATU Sligo College, which is one of 8 campuses of the Atlantic Technology University. We also have the pleasure of John Bradley and Caitriona Mullan's company this morning, who are going to bring their perspectives to the discussion. So John Bradley is one of today's respondents. He's carried out a multitude of research and published extensively on the all-island economy, and is a former Economic Research Centre member at in Northern Ireland. You know, I've worked and observed John's work in the past, and he's also was a research professor with the SRI. And Caitriona Mullan, Caitriona is a specialist in governance and leadership for collaborative and transboundary working, with roles including ICLRD facilitator for the Northwest Strategic Growth Partnership, and also as an expert with the Council of Europe's Centre for Expertise for Good Governance. So a couple of very good commentators on the discussion this morning. So in terms of format this morning, I'm going to bring Niall in to take us through his presentation. We'll follow with a response from John and Caitriona. And then if you would like to answer a question or bring in some questions, we'd really welcome that through that function, with a hope to finishing up around 11:45 this morning. So I hope you enjoy the proceedings this morning, and I'm going to hand over to Niall now to give the presentation.
Thank you, Chair, and thank you and welcome to everybody who has joined us. Niall O'Donnellan here, as has been explained, regional economist and formerly chair Sligo Institute of Technology, now Sligo College of Atlantic Technology University, and co-author with Dr. Brendan McCormack, head emeritus of Sligo College, ATU. I'm speaking on behalf of myself and Brendan. As already been mentioned, Brendan unfortunately cannot be with us today due to illness. I'd also just like to thank the Centre for Cross-Border Studies for the opportunity to share our perspective on all-island regional development. It all started actually a few years ago when Brendan was asking, how can Sligo town grow employment? And as we discussed that, we realised we had to widen the question, first of all to Sligo County, then to the Northwest Borders region, including right up to Letterkenny and the important work that's been done there as part of the partnership. And Paul Hannigan, Brendan's counterpart in Letterkenny, a key figure there. Then that we extended to the Northern and Western Nuts 2 region, and then further to the Republic and its National Development Plan, Project 2040, which was actually launched in Sligo Institute of Technology back in 2018. And then as we gradually teased the issues through, we focused on work that had already been done, John Bradley's work and others, on an all-island perspective and on beyond that. And in a sense, our contention is that no matter what place we are in and what place we are coming from, we start from, any of us, that we progress inevitably towards understanding and asking, what is our role in the wider, that our place plays in the wider system? So, next slide, please. So the report itself, we focus on, which is published earlier in spring. We basically focus on spatial development and perspective of the Project 2040, the key regional divide in the Republic towards an all-island perspective, and then a strategic approach. And as we look at the spatial perspective of Project 2040, 2018, we see in it a vision of balanced region development in the Republic. And in it, we see the strategy being that there will continue to be a growing Dublin Mid-East, but balanced by 4 urban centres of Cork, Limerick, Galway, and Waterford. And this discussion has been enriched and amplified by inputs from the Architects and Engineers associations, the Irish Cities 2070, which focuses on dense urban growth around green belts, inclusive mixed neighbourhoods, and also other significant contributors such as Frank MacDonald, Una Mullally, and others. And again, our perspective is particularly focused on the city regions, and particularly based on the work of Jane Jacobs, the great urbanologist, and her work in terms of understanding how cities actually interact with the broader region that they are part of. And so our perspective is that the National Development Plan and Framework do give a strong strategic framework to regional spatial development. Its approach to strengthen the urban cities outside of Dublin and the East to balance. Our comment on that is that there's actually a really strong need to really see those 4 cities working together in partnership as a counterbalancing city region, as almost a kind of an Atlantic urban arc, counterbalancing the city region in the on the island. But particularly we see, and this is where we raised a major question, well, where is the substantial development of the Northwest, which is in the National Development Plan described as beyond the hinterland of cities, an echo, if I could say, of beyond the pale, and when its development will take place after the 4 urban areas of the Republic are developed according to the strategy, and indeed the question might be raised even if that is the case. So for us, there are central flaws in the overall approach in the spatial strategy. And first of all, it's a lack of focus on the fundamental regional imbalance in the state. We would suggest that the Dublin-Galway urban line is a clear regional economic divide in the Republic, with the counties above that generally underperforming in various indicators compared to the rest of the country underneath that line. The second challenge and difficulty and constraint in the strategy is the lack of an all-island perspective, and indeed a myopia, if I could put it like that, on spatial hierarchies within Northern Ireland. And they, of course, have major impact and influences on the counties adjacent and further south. And the 2 issues for us are linked, because growth in the Northern and Western region is driven by growth in and interaction with the Northern Ireland economy, as well as, and questioned as much as, by growth in the Eastern Midlands and the southern regions of the Republic. And all we have to do, as people are very familiar with, is that integrated supply chain and agri-food with Lakeland, Keepack, also in engineering right across the border counties on both sides. A very integrated supply chain is exemplified by Combi-Lift having many suppliers in Fermanagh and other areas. And indeed, if you look at other manufacturing, Randox with its Randox Cho in Donegal, Uform, one of the most advanced wood products companies on the island in Antrim, has a major subsidiary, Ashling, in Donegal. Tourism, of course, the strong interaction and crossovers there. And more recently, and most interestingly, or as interestingly perhaps, FinTech, Fintru rather, headquartered in Belfast, strong operations in Derry, Londonderry, and recently announced a 300 expansion in Letterkenny. So for us, our overall perspective on the National Development Plan is that to achieve true regional balance as aspired to, there needs to be a need to prioritise and step change the development of the northern counties in the Republic. And so to the key regional divide, as already mentioned, the counties, most of the counties above, the 9 counties above that divide, it's the border region and what we'd call the rural west, Galway City being below the border, but certainly the line, but basically most of the west above it, indeed some of the Midlands as well. But of those 9 counties, 8 of them are actually have suffered population decline over the last century, and 8 or most of them of the counties in the Republic who are actually lower disposable incomes are actually, most of them are actually above that line. And similarly, when we look at the overall map of the island, we see the blind spot in terms of strategy, in terms of the spatial hierarchies and structures within Northern Ireland, which they have major impact on both the border and further south counties. So again, this is not news. The underperformance compared to the other regions of Northern Western region has been long recognised, and indeed it is gone on a journey which is not a positive journey in terms of relatively falling back to transition region below the EU average incomes, and now further fall to becoming a lagging region in EU terms. And while this is relative, in many cases also is affected in absolute terms as well, in some ways, in many ways. So actually, if you look at the Northern Western region, across about 25 key economic, social and education indicators. Of the Republic's 8 NUTS 3 regions, the Northwest borders averages last, and the West averages within the upper bottom half. And if you combine the two, they are, it is clear the Northern Western NUTS 2 region is very much at the bottom of development compared to the other regions in the country, in the Republic. And we go through these slides quickly. We don't need to dwell on each of the indicators except to the last one. Just go back to that. If we just draw attention to one indicator, and that is the 15 to 25-year-olds and the projected growth in that group of people from 21 up to 36. And in the border region, the Northwest border region, that actually change is negative, going down by about 7%. According to the population projections. The West is just about static, just above it, about 2%. And there, the Republic is actually an increase overall of 7%, and in Dublin, a change of 23%. And this is this is the challenge in demographics that the region faces. And that is actually challenging in terms of the future relative to other regions. Yes, the recent census population statistics results would change some of those numbers, but actually they won't change broadly the relative balances and imbalances that we are looking at. And so the central development challenge for the borders and adjacent rural West region is how can we build self-generating internal innovation and creative capabilities and dynamics? How can we build the capabilities of our population to actually generate new ideas, develop new businesses, increase the capacities of existing businesses? And also, how can we enrich and enhance the external linkages to the proximate city regions, which of course are, if you go to the east, Dublin Eastern region, obviously go to the south in the Cork, Limerick, Galway, Waterford region, and go north to the Belfast City region and Derry, of course, as well. So this is an agenda which is what we call an indicative Northern Western growth agenda. It's based on the Northern and Western Regional Assembly regional social and economic strategy, and on the Irish Central Borders Area Network framework for regional priorities and others. And the strategies that have been developed by these groups and networks are about enhancing development within the region through productivity, ecosystems, and clustering strategies, and so on. I would draw attention maybe to two in particular that are important. In particular, one is remote working. And I think the reality is that COVID has really shown that remote working is a game changer. And the work of the Northern and Western Regional Assembly, the Western Development Commission in particular, and others, has really focused on how can we in the regions actually avail of that as a game changer. I think the question, and there certainly has been a lot of good work done on regional hubs and so forth, but I think the real issue is that at national level, remote working is not yet seen strategically as a major instrument of regional development. And that's an issue. And for us, it's about actually aiming at relocating over 5 years into the region, over 30,000+ jobs from a remote working perspective. And the second point I'd maybe draw attention to in terms of the actions, in terms of development, is actually how do we maximize the mutual benefit of growth, economic growth in Northern Ireland, and availing of the opportunities from the 10X strategy, the growth deals, and so on, and all around the collaboration to help achieve that through IDA and West Northern Ireland working together and so forth. And so just to maybe reinforce the point about Northern Ireland and the northern western region, actually, if we just look at the actual physical distances, again, if you look at the National Development Plan, it talks about improving access for the northwest to the east, obviously to Dublin and so forth, and to Cork and Galway, but it doesn't actually talk about to the northern Belfast and Derry, which of course for the border counties of and areas of Letterkenny, Sligo, Cavan, and so on, actually Belfast is closer in most respects and most regards than these other areas. So, so to us, there's for myself and Brendan, it's around looking at a more strategic approach in terms of an all-Ireland perspective and giving the northern counties a real chance and getting beyond the kind of limitations of beyond the hinterland of cities constraint, which is embedded, if you like, in the national regional development, and looking at rethinking cross-border regional development based on the work of John Bradley and Michael Best and many others. And the question of, can there be an evolution of a northern network, if you like, that can actually provide an extra magnet and roots in terms of economic development. So for us, obviously looking at it in terms of growth hubs, and the key growth hubs which have already been identified, and we see the Northwest Strategic Growth Partnership really important, and actually again ATU, Letterkenny and UU and others have been very centrally involved in driving that forward. Obviously the work of ICBAN and the Mid-Southwest region, very important in driving growth in that area. A lot of lessons to be learned, if you like, from the work in further north, and of course the Newry and Dundalk drive, the M1 motorway concept and region and so on. These are growth hubs that we think are really important to actually maximize. They're about 300,000 people each, and the ability to harness the synergies and scale that's implicit in that from an economic development and social development point of view is really key to actually growing the broader northern and western region. And of course, linking in with growth in Northern Ireland, and particularly with the growth in the Belfast region, the metropolitan Belfast region, and indeed with Causeway Coast and Glens, Mid and East Antrim, and of course the other cross-border growth hubs which we've already talked about. And the really interesting thing, I think, is that each of these areas have actually been the beneficiaries of a city deal or a city and growth deal in recent times. And that for us is very significant in terms of an opportunity to accelerate growth in the growth hubs and therefore in the broader region. So for us, the question becomes, click to the next, the growth strategies basically of the National Development Plan talk about two center city regions broadly in the Republic, in the south of the half of the island, if you like. And then the question for us is, can a similar scale of broad network or cluster, whatever, be broadened to being encouraged, strengthened, building on the work that's already going on in terms of coordination at local authority and other levels within the growth hubs and so forth. And that those city regions that we talked about there are linked if we could, in terms of linkages such as the Atlantic Economic Corridor, the higher education institutions in Atlantic TU and University of Galway, the Western Rail Corridor and the sectoral clusters, roads, and also high-speed rail, the Northwest Rail Corridor, the proposal to link Portadown with Derry, Londonderry, and therefore make access to the Dublin rail network stronger, sector clusters, the M1 corridor, higher education, and of course the high-speed rail and clusters in higher education links as well with the southern region as well. And these are all linkages. Again, we would suggest there can be joining up the dots in many ways between them in a more strategic way, even physically joining up the dots, particularly for the Northwest Rail Corridor and the Western Rail Corridor and the high-speed rail proposal. These are all opportunities to actually develop a more coherent approach to the spatial development in the northern half of the island, as it were. And why, I suppose the question would be, why does this matter? I mean, we're kind of, focusing on a scale of population of 2.5 million people and evolving it both in terms of the Dublin East, the southern region, let's call it the Atlantic urban arc, if you like, Galway, Limerick, Cork, and Waterford, and some possible northern network, urban rural network. And why does it matter? Well, actually, scale and proximity actually matter from a geographic spatial perspective. And if we look particularly, or for example, at the European Observatory and clusters, sectoral clusters, they actually identify that the greater the population size, up to about 2.5 million, 3 million people, the greater the number of clusters, and the greater number of performing clusters brings higher productivity and brings higher incomes. So it does actually matter, this scale and proximity. But it's within a broad urban-rural networks with mutually reinforcing levels. In other words, there are 3 possible city regions. Within that, then, this is a system, though, where there are also different levels of cities, of the growth hubs we've talked about, alliance of towns at county level, individual towns, villages and groups of villages, and of course, rural areas and islands. And Brendan and Paul and others have actually done really interesting work, Atlantic Technology University and others, working with some of the islands in terms of how can they actually grow. And for us, Brendan and myself, the question is, how are they part of a broader system which actually can reinforce and support and develop the services that they need? So I suppose the question becomes, and it is a question, it's for discussion and for reflection, is there a northern rural, urban rural network, a spatial framework that evades of scale and synergies, and which can cover key areas as transport and infrastructure and other areas, circular economy, and has some kind of process of coordination in terms of consultation and so forth, and particularly focuses on the ability of the Northern Ireland as a distinct jurisdiction, and of the Northwest region and associated groupings, if you like, to actually coordinate and to develop spatial strategies and so forth. And that's a question and maybe a focus for discussion. So I think for us, the kind of strategic development for the Northwest and Borders region is about looking at how can we link to the 3 urban rural networks. In all fairness, we do see it as one which links proactively with all 3 urban rural networks on the island, as we see it, as we see at least the makings of them. And so for us, it is about the Northwest and the rural West not being seen as peripheral and out there, and that it's a region that really must wait its turn, which invariably is highly unlikely to ever come about, but is actually a region which is strategic, which is central, and which is critical to the development of the all Ireland economy and society. and is also important to actually and critical to link that region with the wider islands and other European networks of cities, and indeed to link it with the broader and wider globe. And I think this is our sense of where we must go if we are to enhance our place, and as all other places must go if they are to enhance their place, to look at it in a wider context and in a wider system of development. And so to conclude, obviously conversation to be had as to whether this sense of the spatial shape of the and possibilities on the islands are on the island is coherent and sensible, and obviously whether this can be achieved and moved in that direction. The key point, or one key point to make, is both jurisdictions on the island are noted as being amongst the most centralized administrations in the world, in that the both London-centric jurisdiction and the Dublin-centric jurisdiction are actually highly centralized. And if we can move, and there's an underpinning all of this, in our view, myself and Brendan's view, is a need for decentralization and subsidiarity. And the great apostle of devolution and decentralization, T.J. Barrington, in the 70s, writes about bringing the discharge of public business near the people in respect of whom it is discharged. And it may be a little bit, how to put it, disconcerting, perhaps is one word, to actually see that much of the things that T.J. Barrington talked about and analysed in his excellent discussions in the 70s still remains to be translated in many ways within the Republic. Perhaps on a more positive note, I think it's really important and interesting to see that in the UK government's levelling up strategy, they have very much focused on devolution and decentralization as one instrument of development. And whilst the detail here, as I understand it, refers to decentralization within England, there's also applicability in terms of principles to the devolved administrations, and indeed many questions and lessons to be learned from this for policymakers in the Republic as well. So on that note, I'd just like to thank you for listening and hand it back to the chair for comments and questions.
Thank you very much, Niall. I'm going to just move on now to let John Bradley make some commentary first, and then we'll ask Caitriona to come in as well. So John, thank you.
Thank you, Maureen. I was very pleased to be asked to open the commentary on the paper by Brendan and Niall. It's both complex and comprehensive. And in it, they bring together two crucial but ill-understood challenges to economic policymaking in Ireland. And these are, first, the regional development challenges faced by the Northern and Western NUTS 2 region of Ireland. And second, how the existence of the border complicates island-wide regional development strategy, particularly in those counties adjacent to the border and even further afield. Now, in commenting on this paper, I do so after an association with cross-border economic research at the national level that goes back to the late 1980s, when I explored how the two macroeconomies on this island, Ireland and Northern Ireland, interacted and how these interactions might be made more effective. However, my involvement with cross-border regional research only started with the CCBS study that Professor Mike Best and I did back in 2012. This was Cross-Border Economic Renewal, Rethinking Irish Regional Policy. Whenever I re-examine our 2012 study, I'm embarrassed at how we threw up lots of analysis and ideas, but we never succeeded in joining them up in any coherent way. However, as the present paper demonstrates, research on regional development strategy has evolved since then, even if not always in a good way. Irish economists have tended to neglect research in the area of regional development in favor of more academically prestigious national and international macroeconomic research. In particular, there's been very little examination of the nature of the regional enterprise sector. So in 2012, Mike and I had to carry out a lot of ground clearing work in a short time and with very limited resources. The steering committee for our 2012 study consisted mainly of Northern Ireland government agency people who were rather displeased that Mike and I proposed to travel around the border area to talk to business owners and other local organizations about how they were getting on and how the border affected them. If we'd listened to their criticism, our project could have been deflected and constrained to reflect the view that, not to mince words, official Northern Ireland actually had little interest in development on the southern side of the border or in cross-border cooperation, a lack of interest that was broadly shared by the equivalent Irish development agencies. Competition rather than cooperation was the name of the cross-border game. Actual strategic regional development cooperation on this island effectively stopped at the border, even if the rhetoric did not. Jumping ahead to the analysis by Brendan and Niall, I like the approach taken in their paper. It's wide-ranging and it's comprehensive. So for the purposes of commentary, I'll try to summarize the strategic approach in a very simple way. First, Brendan and Niall believe that Project Ireland 2040 has set the correct strategic direction for Irish national and regional development out into the long term. Second, they believe that the peripherality of the northern and western region of Ireland and the western regions of Northern Ireland require more specific considerations if they are not to lose out further to the more rapid progress of the main metropolitan agglomerations on the island. And third, they believe that cross-border strategic analysis and action needs to be greatly expanded if the wider northwest region of the island is to prosper. Now, in brief, while I accept the second and third proposition, in other words, the northwest region is in bad shape and cross-border cooperation could help address the problem, I do not accept the first, i.e., that Project Ireland 2040 sets the correct strategic direction. This has very serious implications for the second and third proposition, and let me explain why. First, once Project Ireland 2040 became the core statement of strategic development in Ireland, any prospects for equitable, innovative, and potentially successful regional development in the island and in Ireland and on the wider island were lost. Unlike the present paper, and Niall and Brendan's one, which draws carefully on national and international research findings, Project Ireland 2040 had no research or analysis foundations whatsoever. It was to a large extent political public relations rhetoric and superficial discussion of a kind that is very common today in many public policy areas. It was erected on a three-way division of Ireland into Northern and Western, Southern and Eastern and Midlands that had no joined-up social or economic logic and no effective regional governance structures. Its bottom line was a bold statement of the primacy of metropolitan urban development focused on 5 Irish cities, all of them located south of the line from Dublin to Galway, as Brendan and Niall emphasise. North of that line, policy degenerates into palliative care and rural community support that holds out no prospect of any radical change because the drivers of that change are not correctly identified. Second, with respect to the identification of the specific development needs of the Irish Northern and Western NUTS 2 region, once Project Ireland 2040 took a firm grip on Irish government thinking of regional policy, it became difficult to formulate a development strategy for the Northern and Western region that recognised the need for a radically different and more challenging approach that was based on detailed knowledge of the internal workings of the economies of Irish counties and the building up of linkages between their many small, scattered towns, rather than relying on trickle-down from largely absent urban agglomerations. The present paper by Brendan and Niall clearly acknowledges this challenge, but it does not express it forcefully enough. Being nice to Project Ireland 2040 is perhaps not the best way to encourage change in it. And thirdly, the one area where the Irish government has displayed interest and enthusiasm for regional development is in the cross-border issue. However, I believe that they see this mainly in a political context as support for the Good Friday Agreement, rather than in an economic context, as a need to marry internal cross-region development within Ireland to wider cross-border development issues on the whole island. The recent project on a shared island initiative illustrates this flawed way of thinking. Shared Island is an Irish government initiative, but with not even a spectral presence of official Northern Ireland and UK government contribution to the process. There are, of course, the institutions of the Good Friday Agreement, but these are weak and minimalist. So the message I get is that we, here in Ireland, may want to cooperate, but many of them in Northern Ireland are not wild about the idea. Unfortunately, cooperation can be encouraged, but it cannot be imposed. Without open political cooperation, cooperation on cross-border economic development strategy will remain a non-starter. The paper by Brendan and Niall may be somewhat conflicted about Project Ireland 2040. They broadly accept its strategic guiding role, but they critique it in detail. They draw attention to the lack of much truly devolved regional government in Ireland, north and south, but they seem unwilling to conclude that this stands in the way of regional innovation. They accept that centralized government and national organizations control regional strategy, but they fail to draw attention to how this control has been carried out in a vacuum of detailed knowledge of how the peripheral regional economies actually function and perform. The dearth of detailed and business information on how regional economies perform in Ireland is absolutely scandalous. Back in 2019, I carried out an in-depth study of a county economy, Mayo, one of the 8 northern and western regional counties, drawing on published data sources and private investigations of the kind that Mike Best and I did back in 2012, in other words, research by walking about. The resulting report was factual, dull, boring, but provided the kind of information that is absolutely essential to discussions of regional development strategy. Nobody ever writes about county economies. My Irish economist colleagues found it hilarious that I believed that a county had a meaningful economy that was worth investigating. So let me conclude on a wider theme. The partition of our island was a disaster, socially and economically. In a purely rational world, the benefits of sharing our island would be so compelling that they would overcome any fears that still stalk the land. But divisions once created are very difficult to mend. Perhaps the most pragmatic approach would be to acknowledge that the economy of the island, north and south, was cruelly skewed by centuries of disruptive history that left many peripheral communities in its train, locked out of modern development opportunities. The Northwest region is a prisoner of history, not of geography. Addressing these internal problems is a necessary first step prior to addressing wider secondary cross-border problems. A thriving North and South could eventually cooperate as naturally as members of the EU do, and in a way that could be equally effective. Thank you.
Thank you very much, John, for a very thought-provoking discussion as always. What I will do is I'll bring Niall in after Caitriona just to have a response to both of the comments. So I'd like to bring in Caitriona now just to also provide her commentary on the discussion so far on the paper. Thank you.
Sure. Thank you, Maureen, and thank you to Anthony and colleagues at the Centre for Cross-Border Studies for inviting me to participate in make the contribution this morning. I also, I'm just remembering that actually, John, in the mid-90s, I was present at the Forum for Peace and Reconciliation as a graduate researcher when you delivered a paper. I think it was one of the very early analyses of the nature of the problem in terms of the economies of the island and the principles underlying its resolution. So it's a great pleasure to be able to share a panel with you today as a speaker many, many years later. In terms of I suppose the report, I mean, I welcome it. I operate with, in a sense, a foot in the world of cross-border spatial governance and a foot in the issue of economic and territorial development. So for me, this report raises some very important issues, which I think do deserve to be discussed. They deserve some attention. And I think the point that John has made and the point that the report makes is that essentially what's necessary in order to really release the potential of things like, you know, a national spatial framework, flawed as it may be, is that in an island context, I think, you know, both administrations and particularly the Irish administration need to broaden a view of spatial and economic North-South cooperation beyond Strand 1 of the Good Friday Agreement. In other words, there has been an overfocus on the political dynamics at that higher level. Everything seems to be seen through that particular lens. But when you actually consider the reality of the local government partnerships along the border, and by those I mean the East Border region, the Irish Central Border Area Network, and the Northwest Strategic Growth Partnerships, those are essentially structures that were set up for that kind of spatial and economic development beyond borders, which really matters to communities on the ground, to the economies of those areas. The other thing that's a very important point to make is that in terms of cross-party political support, those local government networks have had absolutely unanimous, unbroken cross-party political support on both sides of the border since their establishment. That has been absolutely unbroken. So if you compare if you compare that to the perception that nothing's happening and that there isn't sufficient political support for proceeding with more spatially and economically focused cooperation, it's completely incorrect. I think in terms of the issues that this report raises, I think it's very clear, and it's clear from other work that I've been doing, particularly in relation to territorial innovation systems in the west of Ireland and the northwest. You know, the rationale for Ireland to look at its, I suppose, its border economy has changed significantly. You know, there are issues around competitiveness, there are issues around innovation status, particularly of the northern and western region, and that's not because of the structures that are there that can actually help to release potential. So, for example, we do actually have in the northern and western region, and Paul Hannigan recently made this point, you know, the indicators, for example, for school completion are good in the region. The issue is, you know, what sort of structures are we building in order to retain that potential and to build that potential into economic participation. I think the European cohesion agenda provides a wonderful template for particularly the Irish government to look at its border economy. I think, you know, it's clear that there are opportunities there to look at business integration across borders and across the Northern Ireland border that is meaningful for the economy of both parts of the island. I think it's very important that this issue isn't seen as a constitutional issue, because it quite simply isn't. It's seen as a matter of practicality by many other European countries, that, you know, those agglomerations in their border areas require cross-border cooperative approaches in order to release their contribution, but also in order to contribute to overall economic cohesion across Europe. I mean, if you look at the Benelux Union, you look at what's happening in the Grande Région area, you look at what the German government are now doing with regard to really taking an interest in cross-border economic and administrative and civic cooperation because they understand how important I suppose the populations are. The significant population of the European Union lives in the border region. 30% of the European Union's population lives in a border region. 40% of the European Union's territory is border region. So I think what this report does is really points to the ways in which we need to lift our North-South cooperation agenda on the economy out of the Strand 1 political box and actually look at it as a European policy issue. And it's hugely important. So the report is very helpful in that regard. With regard to governance and recommendations around, for example, an urban rural network in Northern Ireland, I think we have to be careful about falling into the trap of assuming that the natural territorial entity of cooperation is Northern Ireland as defined by the border. Again, the smaller, I suppose, the sub-regions of the border are themselves functional economic areas that themselves are cross-border. So I think it's important that the language, we move away from back-to-back language, that we look at those governance processes and structures that are already there for cooperation, where Interreg has been implemented in those regions for years and years and years, because the local democratic structures are very clear that there is a cross-border relationship, there is a hinterland relationship, and there is economic functionality that can be supported in those areas. So I think I would just say we should probably be careful when we're talking about suggesting how things should be delivered. I think we also have a great cultural preoccupation with setting up structures, and I don't know what that's about. I think the Irish were great administrators. In the context of lots of overseas projects, and in terms of our island neighbours, I think we just need to be careful about getting a balance between assuming that a structure is going to sort everything out and maybe focusing a little bit more on the structures that are there, but the methodology with which interventions can be delivered and developed, and the culture and the behaviour of institutional structures and how they work together. The idea of a social movement approach to building capacity to release that economic potential is one that I'm very fond of. And I also take John's point about where the Shared Island initiative is at the moment. I think there's a great deal more potential for how those ambitions could be realised. And I mean, I do want to note the NESC Shared Island Comprehensive Report, which actually has a lot of material in it that would actually support, decent structural approaches to investment, territorial and spatial investment for economic growth. Within that, my research paper on the development systems in the Northwest and the opportunities for deepening collaboration in the Northwest, actually one of the focus groups within that research brought up this idea of there actually needing to be a very, very comprehensive root and branch Colleton-style North-South economic planning exercise conducted, which goes beyond, which really does look at the longer term across the island, which looks at the various systems and investments that need to be there, but which also looks at the changed nature of the future of work as a result of the pandemic, as a result of the need for green transformation, and also in terms of how that has changed forms of economic participation. So that's something that's just been thrown out into the ether. Maybe somebody will take it up and do something with it. Spatially, in terms of the report, Niall has made some very, very strong points about that, Dublin-Galway, sort of the Meridian line, and what happens above and below that. I would also say, as an additional balance to that, and it is referenced in the report, but I would probably emphasise even further the idea of an Atlantic innovation corridor that runs from Cork to Derry, because in terms of the Northwest structures, certainly people in this region see themselves as very much part of that, I suppose, being at the top of an Atlantic corridor. In terms of the, I suppose, to come back to the comments on Ireland 2040, I was involved in, and still am involved in, facilitating the Northwest Strategic Growth Partnership, which was, I suppose, the next generation of governance for territorial cooperation that was needed for the Northwest. specifically because it's the 4th largest urban agglomeration on the island after Cork. So the structures that were put in place there are, in terms of spatial governance for territorial cooperation, very particular. It's a partnership that exists in terms of, I suppose, subnational level. It's a partnership that involves central government departments and local authorities operating with a regional cross-border focus. Its primary purpose was to release the potential of that northwest cross-border city region, and the wider, I suppose, the northwest of the island, really. I mean, because the spheres of influence radiate out. It's not just a question of drawing a line at Stranorlar in terms of the impact of that. And again, looking at Ireland 2040, what we actually attempted to do was to have Derry Letterkenny recognised as one of the other urban, in terms of the hierarchy of settlements. So that we weren't quite successful with that, but that's what was wanted in Ireland 2040. And in terms of Derry being a tier 3 settlement, very, very important. Urban agglomerations, suburbs running across the border, all of that. So I think another point there is again the city deals that have been secured by northern local authorities. I think these represent probably a significant departure in the strategic development capacity in Northern Ireland, and also the 10X strategy. I mean, it's a really sophisticated strategy, and I would really encourage officials south of the border to read it and look at it and see how, what that kind of approach could really, really mean for addressing those domestic economic challenges that Ireland has as an EU member state. But so it's really, I think there's a shift required in the approach and thinking about what North-South cooperation means for Ireland Inc. I think there is further opportunity to create a link between, national economic sustainability and what happens on a cross-border basis, and what happens with regard to the economy of Northern Ireland, what happens with regard to releasing innovation potential in the border counties. There's significant additional connectivity that can be achieved, for example, for innovation pipelines for companies, looking at R&D clustering, looking at the assets that are there in Northern Ireland, and vice versa. Those kind of institutions that are able to do that are already working together. Atlantic Technical University, and previously at Letterkenny Institute of Technology, has been in a strategic educational alliance with Ulster University and with the further education providers in the Northwest for quite some years now. There are these relationships there. People do recognize that this kind of spatial territorial collaboration is necessary, that the relationships are necessary, the pathways are necessary. What we need is government to get that and to start to actually support it, and to see the connection between things like the Shared Island Agenda and that work that's already going on the ground. And I believe that there's a great deal more potential if we can start to encourage that kind of thinking. In terms of I don't disagree with anything in the report. I think it's just, worth looking at what the report says, and then, what structures are already there that can actually start to, tease out these issues. And I don't think there's a structure that I know of in the northern or western region that wouldn't agree with an awful lot of this stuff. And in a way, I think for me, the biggest challenge of moving these issues center stage is that the issue of the border and the issue of North-South cooperation needs to evolve into an issue of, I suppose, that's very, very directly linked to national economic growth, that the mechanisms that we have for institutional North-South cooperation and regional cross-border cooperation, we ought to remember those are the envy of Europe, of member states across Europe, in terms of the level of legal competency that we have to do this stuff really, really comprehensively, in terms of the Good Friday Agreement, and the fact that a lot of those arrangements have passed into primary legislation in both jurisdictions. I think it's a matter of then looking at, well, central, as Niall has says, very centralized public administrative cultures in both places, I would argue that actually probably Northern Ireland and within the UK, we may have the edge around understanding the role of devolved structures because of things like the City Deal, because of the fact that, for example, local authorities in Northern Ireland are able to raise revenue way beyond the capacity of local authorities in the South. I think the public administrative community in, for example, Northern Ireland very much takes account of the roles of chief executives, of arm's length bodies, of devolved structures. In others, they are part of a community, they are viewed by central administrators as part of a community of practice without whom it would be impossible to run the public system. I think there's a little bit more work that can be done around looking at how public administrative culture, both sides of the border, but maybe particularly in Ireland, how that can evolve to really empower the kind of devolved working that is going to be necessary for the Irish economy to retain an edge and also to exploit those kind of opportunities that are now upon us. We have an energy crisis. I mean, there's war in Europe. We have a massive and urgent need to transition. The northern and western region of the island has some of the richest wind energy resources on the planet. We should be looking at what our contribution to a European hydrogen economy is going to be. What does that mean for, spatial distribution in the west of Ireland? What does that mean for communities that have hauled wet turf up and down mountains for generations? What does that look like in terms of a just transition? So I think for me, the report points to issues that anyone involved in economic territorial development is well aware of. And I think the biggest challenge is to really, really try and open a discussion with central policy making around what is needed in terms of evolution of public administrative approaches, methodologies for investment, devolving investment, and thinking beyond the border as simply a political and diplomatic issue that needs to be taken care of because we signed an agreement in 98 that said that we would do that. So I think that we're in a different era. And I, again, just want to say thanks for the opportunity to comment. I hope it hasn't been too scattered. I just wanted to hand back to the chair now. I'm quite happy to respond again or just to also hear the comments that Niall's going to make in response.
Thank you very much, Caitriona. Again, another thought-provoking response. And, it's interesting even just to hear your direct experience of working across the border. So, a couple of key things. I was struck by John's point that that Niall was being nice to Project 2040. So it'd be interesting to hear his response on that. And also the fact, as you say, Caitriona, that so much of this is happening already, and from a bottom-up perspective, the activity is really quite quite striking, and how you actually translate that into something bigger is really the issue. So Niall, would you like to come back? I'm just conscious of time, so we're hoping to clear up around 1:45, but also if anyone has any questions while Niall responds, that would be great to get your views. Thank you.
Sure. Okay. First of all, thanks to John and Caitriona for an extremely rich feedback and insight based on both your enormous experiences of economic development and the regional challenges. Just very some quick points, because I'm conscious of other people, perhaps some really experienced people around the table virtually. So I think just to give everybody a chance to input, but just very quick points. Just maybe going to John's point about the tension, I think, and yes, I think within Project 2040 and our perspective on it, and yes, it is a perspective glass half full, half empty, and I think we would see it as a framework, but a framework that has to fundamentally evolve to deal with the real issues. Actually, if we park, if we can for a minute, the kind of northern half of the island above the Galway-Dublin line, actually there's real issues in the strategy for the urban areas that actually, the Dublin East and indeed the let's call it the Atlantic urban arc, Cork, Limerick, Galway and Waterford, and that is around, as John rightly points out, the peripherality of regions who have been locked out of development. And I'm talking about rural areas, islands, and also working class inner city communities. These are huge issues that are not actually dealt with at all, or even touched on, if I could put it like that, in that. And that's why I think the work of the Irish Cities 2070 is quite interesting, and Mullan's recent article in the Irish Times is absolutely fundamental. But I would actually make a point and going to reinforce John's point around the, how to put it, the lack of joined up thinking that is really behind Irish Republic of Ireland's Senate policy making, and that is the role of post offices. There was a recent review of post offices carried out at central level to see whether any more functions could be devolved to the post offices, and all departments were asked had they anything they could contribute, and surprise, surprise, nobody apparently could actually contribute some extra functions. And this is a fundamental issue about the survival of rural communities, because post offices are central to that survival. So just maybe just respond to that point. Yes, we do see it as half, that it does contribute to something, the Project 2040 in terms of broad framework, but it's fundamentally challenged, even if you just take the southern half of the island. And then, of course, when you take the interests of both the northern western region, absolutely more or less written off, frankly. And I totally agree with the comments about that actually they do not take into account anything about that whole north-south cooperation and the whole economic and social development that's required interaction, as has been done at a practical level by various people. I totally agree with John also about the need for detailed research at local, county, regional level. And again, John's work on Mayo is actually a model in that respect, and hopefully further work can be done on that. Just to so just on Caitriona's point again, I would strongly support, like this is really about focus on economic and social development and the practicalities of how communities, individuals, families can actually be helped to work together to have better lives through making the systems, economic and social systems, at whatever, at all levels, work more effectively and efficiently together. And again, I would add, and thanks, Caitriona, for pointing that out. It's very much a matter of focusing on the existing work that's been done, huge amount of practical on the ground work. Paul Hannigan's work has been mentioned, and indeed the whole group up in Letterkenny, Derry, London, Derry, Strabane, and so on. The work on ICBAN and the M1 Eastern Border region. All of these groups are, for at least a decade plus more, have actually been working at a very practical way about how can we make things work better for ourselves for mutual benefit. And that's really the fundamental focus. And I like the added in aspect of that. Actually, there's a lot of experience throughout Europe around cross-border cooperation and making practical things work through whatever structures happen to be there. I certainly would completely concur with that. And yeah, I think there's always, I think there's a balance, maybe I could put it like that, in terms of the city region, urban structure, urban rural structure that is there or is evolving, and the linkages between them. So the Atlantic Economic Corridor, Atlantic Innovation Corridor, from all the way Kerry, Cork, right up to Donegal and so forth, is a very important linkage with huge potential. And not least with the addition of now Atlantic Technology University, as well, of course, as the other universities, both established and new, and so on that corridor. So I'd just like to thank again. I'm sure I haven't responded to all the points, but I'd certainly like to thank people, John and Caitriona's huge commentary and insight. And very much appreciated. Actually, sorry, one last point about Caitriona's point. I think culture, that's the key word I think is really important. It's actually about a culture and a mind shift as distinct from structures and processes and okay, and I agree totally. I think this is about the practicalities of economic and social cooperation. The Belfast Good Friday Agreement is that's a different set of issues, and we need, what we're focusing, Brenda and myself, are on the practicalities of how can we make life better for the communities we're part of. Thank you.
Thank you, Niall. I'm conscious there's no questions in the chat, so if anyone does want to raise a question, if they want to do it now, just to make some observations myself, and maybe to pose a question. thought this was an excellent discussion and presentation. And as I sat here, I thought this needs to go to a wider audience because it is so critical, you know, from all sorts of perspectives. I suppose thinking from a northern and from a northern perspective, I think there's a lot that we would envy, or I would envy, in terms of how the South goes about development generally. You know, you do have your Project 2040. We don't have an investment strategy in Northern Ireland, or at least not one that's functioning as with most things in the north. Struck again by the city and growth deals, and your point, Neil, that really you need it. You know, you need a couple of, you know, 2.5 million to really make these spatial strategies work. You know, in the north we have 4 city and growth deals now. So you know, population 1.9 million, and we've got 4. So, you know, great to see something like that happening. But again, a challenge because it has had to be, you know, those smaller areas arguably, you know, will they work? So that's something to see. Levelling up, it was mentioned as well. Interesting, you know, because Northern Ireland actually has been one of the least beneficiaries of levelling up so far. Very different approach taken by UK government, and bypassing the departments, you know, bypassing departments in Northern Ireland and giving it to individual projects. So in terms of I'd imagine there'd be lessons learned in terms of levelling up and how you might actually go about that whole process, particularly from a Northern Ireland perspective, you know, and who gets what in terms of what that money means. And replacement EU funding is sitting in the background as well. But so you know, that the other point I'd make as well, just again from working on both sides of the border, John's point on not understanding, you know, sub-regional areas well enough in the south, that's really struck me about how poor the data's been, you know, at council level, county council level in the south, you know, compared to the kind of data that we have in Northern Ireland. And that makes it very difficult to think, you know, cross-jurisdictionally, you know, or try to understand it better because of that data gap. I suppose just one question I would like to pose is, you know, do you think the message gets out strongly enough around the fact that all of this does happen, you know, in terms of cross-border cooperation at different levels? So why does it not make its way enough to central government, do you think? You know, or is there a different way of getting this message across that this happens and it actually works?
Ryan, could I come in? Could I come in and respond to that? Just first up, in terms of the fact that I'm working in an interlocutory role between the region and central government at the moment. I think central government are very well aware of what is going on. I think there is an understanding of the structures. I don't think, frankly, I think the penny needs to drop further around what those structures mean for good public administration by central governments, what those kind of structures mean for the potential to really look at, you know, ambitious, dramatic shifts in how public investment is made and how it is devolved to a point where it can be informed by territorial need. And I think that is essentially, you know, a culture shift that's needed in public administrative culture, particularly in Ireland, because the UK has gone through a process of devolution and devolved public administrative consciousness since the 1990s. Granted, you know, the idea that, you know, a central government fund could actually completely bypass the Northern Ireland administration, you know, the executive administration, you know, in some ways not a bad thing. In other ways, yes, okay, you know, there might need to be a more strategic approach there. But at the same time, I mean, the idea of, I still think I don't think it's a lack of information being received by central government as to what's there in terms of those territorial structures. I think it is a shift in consciousness that is needed from a public administrative reform point of view, and a cultural issue. And I'm not quite sure how that happens until the system itself is willing to reflect on itself.
Okay. Thank you, Caitriona. I've got a couple of more questions here. I'm conscious of just making sure that that those, someone has a say on those. In terms of the Helen has asked the question, do the authors and responders have a view on the Irish National Development Plan and its reference to the shared island work? You know, where that's positioned and how that shared island work goes forward. One from Colin, how important has been the Voluntary Transport Vision 2020 report in 2004 by the Irish Academy of Engineering, looking at sea, air, road, rail infrastructure need for 2050 with the population of Ireland. We have another question. Yes, just a response in terms of spatial city. So those two questions, key questions there, the shared island work and how that fits into the National Development Plan, and also the Transport Vision 2020 and how that fits in, if someone would like to respond on those. Any takers?
Could I respond kind of tangentially to those? Caitriona made a very interesting point where she commented that we are preoccupied with setting up structures and we should really get on and work with the existing structures. I have a slightly different take on that, which addresses the two questions you've just asked, Maureen. And that is that at the very highest level of government, Belfast and Dublin, where budgets can be arranged and decisions can be taken, you can get action to bring about the kind of strategic development needs that Niall and Brendan talk about. Now, what government does is, at the regional level, is they set up a multitude of small, underfunded organizations, and I would include local government in that category, where at the local level they can do good work, and they do, and Caitriona has talked about that. But they cannot address the big strategic development issue that Niall and Brendan are onto. They haven't got the budgets. Many of the decisions on, say, physical infrastructure, which is crucial to diminishing peripherality, are not controlled at the local level. The National Roads Authority handles all the roads. So you have an appearance of good work being done at a local level. And why isn't government listening? It's not that government isn't listening. Government doesn't wish to listen. They wish to control the really big strategic investment decisions, and they will leave the crumbs and the small detail to local organizations, including local government. And the Shared Island Initiative is also an example of diffusing these issues across a whole range of social and economic categories. Who's in charge? I mean, the most frustrating thing about doing economic research in Ireland, particularly regional economic research, is that Ireland is full of clever people, intelligent people who understand exactly what's wrong, but nothing ever changes. That the institutions of the EU that were set up in the 1950s evolved. They were worked, they were found to needed to be strengthened, they were strengthened, and we end up with the European Union. A test case on cross-border cooperation is that the institutions of the Good Friday Agreement have not evolved one whit. In fact, on the contrary, they've been largely prevented from being operating. So I get very, very pessimistic when I see the lack of clarity in who are the real decision makers on this island and what their game plan is.
Thank you, John. Conscious of time, and I know we aim to close around this time, so would anyone else have anything pressing they'd like to just finalise, and then we can hand over to Anthony just to close the session?
Maureen, if I could just come back on very briefly, and I know
Thanks, Caitriona.
but just to respond to John, I think just to be clear, John, I think my reference to the setting up of structure was probably in keeping with your own point, which is that we have a terrible tendency to set up, shall we say, diffused, regional or local structures to try and take something on, when actually what is needed is a structural approach at central government level. I think looking at, for example, the way the Northern Ireland executive has actually changed how it does a certain amount of its centralised financial planning is interesting. I think looking at the PPMO type governance for cross-government programming that exists in the North is something that the South could look at. I think the Shared Island Agenda, with its commitment to spend 1 billion, is going to struggle to spend a very small percentage of that unless there is some structural approach as to how decisions are made around investments at central government level that runs across government departments. So I think in a way we probably are making different aspects of a similar point, which is we shouldn't be recommending that more structures are set up where more structures are not needed, and what we should be looking for is structural approaches where structural approaches have been unforthcoming to date. And I think structural approaches in central government decision making have to change in order to really, shall we say, update the potential of the North-South collaboration infrastructure for the present time and the challenges ahead economically.
Thank you, Caitriona. So it's one thing that always strikes me is just how small a share of the budget local councils in Northern Ireland get. So I think it's about half that of the South. It's about 4 or 5%, of the total. Obviously in England it's up around 20%. So although arguably obviously bigger populations to cover. So it is an issue about how much do you devolve actually within Northern Ireland. Just to bring this to a close then, sorry, Niall, I think wants one more final point to you, Niall.
No, just very quickly, I mean, just to reinforce the points that are made by Caitriona and John, I think it's around actually also looking at what level of scale of community from rural area right up to city region actually is appropriate for each services. And that is actually the interesting work that T.J. Barrington was doing in the 70s. And I do think that certainly in the Republic, that work has not progressed. And I think Caitriona is right. I certainly think there is a very low culture, in fact, going backwards in terms of understanding that real regional development is about empowering communities, and that big issue is not there.
Yeah, I think that does link into the funding point, and how they're funded. The other, just finally again, I'd like to say that so many strategies here and absolutely no action plan. So we really have a big issue in terms of actually actioning. I think when you action, that's when you actually, John's point about the frustrations and nothing ever happens. If you have actions, then you have to deliver on them, hopefully. So that might encourage a bit more cooperation. So listen, thank you so much for your time this morning, for a great discussion. I think a conversation that needs to keep continuing, and particularly as maybe Northern policy starts to catch up with the South, if it ever does. So somewhere to take this conversation, and I'll just hand over to Anthony to close. So thank you.
Yeah, thank you very much, Maureen. Thank you to Caitriona and to John for responding to Niall's presentation there and the report that he and Brendan co-authored, a really important report. I'd just like to maybe make a couple of my own points. John at one point said that cooperation can be encouraged, it can't be imposed, and I would absolutely agree with that. Encouragement also means encouraging in terms of providing the proper resourcing in order to exploit the potential that is there, and which you can see people attempting to exploit at local level. And I'm not just talking about in terms of local authorities, but in terms of businesses, enterprises, community organizations who are doing that cross-border, that north-south bit. But that encouragement needs to come in the form of proper resourcing to really fully exploit those potentials. The other thing that I would like to pick up on is, again, this question around institutions and structures. The centre is just about is developing its submission to a consultation that's taking place, or an inquiry taking place within the Northern Ireland Affairs Committee in terms of the institutions of the Good Friday Agreement, and particularly Strand 1. And our argument has always been, you can have the most perfect institutions that you want, but unless the people that populate those institutions are there to and dedicate themselves to making those institutions function and are committed to making every single part of those institutions function, then it doesn't matter what structures you have or what institutions you have to have that commitment, that dedication to all everything that's involved within those institutions. The final thing I'd like to kind of pick up on is in terms of, John mentioned and others have mentioned, the lack of evidence that will, for me, and many people have heard me say this before, and you'll hear it again right now, in order to do cross-border cooperation, there's a couple of things well, there's a few things that are essential, but two of them are generosity and curiosity. Without curiosity, you can't really do cross-border cooperation. You need to be interested in what's happening on the other side of the border. You have to want to look for the evidence, want to look for the data that on the other side, in that other jurisdiction, in order not just to solve problems, but really to exploit potentials that can only be fully exploited if you properly understand the context on the other side of the border. And that's that generosity bit, but also obviously the curiosity bit. The generosity is also sharing then the evidence from your own side to the other side of the border in order to make those connections. And just finally on that point, we, again, instead of a cross-border study, perhaps the concept, we could look for a different phrase, is this concept of border proofing of policy, border proofing of legislation, to make sure that whatever a policymaker or legislator is developing, that not only doesn't create obstacles for people living in border regions and to cross-border mobility, but again, make sure that you fully exploit that legislation, that policy, in terms of the opportunities that it might present if you look beyond your own border and seeing what's happening across on the other side of the border. So for example, and on the Irish side, on the southern side, the Cabinet Handbook does say that legislation policy must be looked at in terms of its potential impacts on north-south and actually wider east-west relations as well, and to the institutions. I think we need to kind of take that model, replicate it, and put it into practice. But it's one thing having it as a piece of paper, and there's another thing actually enacting those principles. So I'm just going to that's it from me. I'm so grateful to all of those who took part in this today in terms of presenting, responding to the presentation, to Neil and Brendan's report. And I would really encourage you, those of you who have not yet done so, to look at that report. It's available on our website, free of charge, as always. Look at it, analyze it, read it in detail, because there's a lot in there, a lot of ideas in there, and lots of things that we can take forward. And thank you to all of you who have joined us here today. I'm really grateful to you all, and I hope to see you again all soon. Thank you and goodbye.